If you've ever seen the Hollywood movie Ted, you suspend disbelief. The movie's about this pot-smoking, womanising teddy bear that gets in all sorts of hijinks. And by the time, towards the end of the movie, he's about to have a car accident, you're on the end of your seat. You're worried about Ted. You're almost in tears, worried about what's going to happen to Ted, the pot-smoking teddy bear. Of course, this is suspending disbelief, which is what Hollywood wants you to do so that you can embrace the story, you can get into the characters. And that's precisely what they do in an even sexier topic, multinational tax avoidance, which is all about telling a story. Now, this time of year, we've just had the election, so it's been buried a bit, but all the multinational corporations, the biggest companies in the world which operate in Australia, they all sneakily put their little financial statements into the corporate regulator. You've got to pay $45 a pop to get these things. This is the real information. So once a year, we get a glimpse at how these gigantic companies like Google, Netflix, Facebook, all the oil companies, the car companies, Big Pharma, how they all pay virtually no tax, some of them no tax at all, in Australia on their $1 billion incomes. Just to get to the absolute quintessence of this, of multinational tax avoidance, because you pay tax on your profit. You don't want to make a profit in Australia where the tax rate is 30%. You want to make a profit somewhere else. So what you do is you figure out stories that you can tell the tax man, ways to get your profit overseas. With the oil companies, they give themselves gigantic loans from overseas, and the interest on that loans flows to Singapore or some other haven. In the case of these digital places, Netherlands or Bermuda, Cayman Islands, somewhere where there's a good tax environment for this kind of operation. The aim then, eliminate your profit in Australia and make your profit with those Australian dollars in another country, in another tax jurisdiction. That is the unifying factor in all these tax avoidance fables, these myths that are created by the tax lawyers and their little accountants running around working out how to rip off the Australian people. And they do it so well. And so we're going to have a look at 3 today that remind us of Ted, because they use Hollywood accounting, completely fictional accounting. Netflix Australia, the biggest streaming company in the world. Extremely rapid growth in Australia. 6 million households now have Netflix. And of course, during the 2 years of the pandemic, like never before, we're all chained, captured by our screens, spending hours in front of TV and computers because we weren't allowed to go out. So Netflix, they claim, according to their financial statements filed with ASIC for the year to December 2021, they claim that they made only $30 million in Australia, up from $20 million the year before. If they're charging between $11 and $16 a package for 6 million Australians, they must be making $1 billion. So where did that $1 billion go? Why are they only disclosing $30 million? Because they're telling the story. They're telling a little story, a fable to the Australian Tax Office. And that story is that these profits, this money doesn't really belong in Australia. Yes, we're selling to Australians who are paying us from their Australian incomes. They're watching it on their computers and their televisions in Australia. Some of it is Australian content, but no, it doesn't belong there. Where does it belong? We see a couple of clues from the accounts of Netflix Australia, and it appears to go to Holland, to the land of windmills and clogs. So it just goes directly offshore. Google Australia has always been a massive tax cheat in Australia. They've had different structures in the past that we've exposed them for personally, and they paid more tax. They started to pay more tax until a couple of years ago when the government brought in its ridiculous digital media bargaining code in media reforms. And then they've decided we're not going to pay tax anymore because we've got to pay Rupert Murdoch, Nine Entertainment, Kerry Stokes' Seven. We've got to pay all this sort of bribe money, all this protection money to prop up the coalition's old media allies. And so they've stopped paying tax again. Well, they did pay $86 million actually last year, up from a tax benefit the year before, which means zero during COVID lockdowns. But that 86 million, imagine if you, on your $60,000 or $100,000 income, were to pay 2% of that. That's what Google is paying. It doesn't even disclose. And this is the fable. This is the storytelling. They're spinning the yarn that they only made $1.7 billion in Australia last year, when in fact they brought $7.2 billion in the door, way up on the year before. This has been an absolutely stunning growth story for many years. It's a global monopoly. It's a monopoly in every country. And yet here in Australia, their actual income coming through the door from selling advertising services to Australians is more than 7 billion, but they only disclose their actual revenue in the income statement as 1.7 because they've decided to tell another story. They've decided to change the way that they describe what they believe to be their revenue. This was signed off. With every story, you need an audience and you need your people to suspend disbelief and say, yeah, that's true. Good old EY, Ernst & Young, one of the big four. There they are, for a fee, signing off on this story, on this myth. So where did it all go then, this money? Well, if you scroll down to the very bowels of the accounts, you'll find up the back in note 22 or 23, the related party transactions. And there you will find more than $5 billion has gone out to some other Google associate. We don't even get told the name of this associate, but we know that it's probably overseas because, let's face it, would you rather pay zero tax in Bermuda or 30% tax in Australia? It's a no-brainer. So it's gone offshore somewhere. We're not told where in this statutory financial statement. $5 billion, $5.4 billion in service fees. They've just called it service fees. Now, how do they do this? They do it because they claim that the intellectual property is sitting in another entity. So this belongs legally to another entity. It's still all Google, and therefore $5 billion just goes offshore. Now, Facebook, another example, eBay too, of Hollywood accounting. Facebook just says, here we go, service fees. They say their revenue's in the hundreds of millions, but it's actually, if you go through the accounts, it's actually more than $1 billion. How much tax did Facebook pay? So Facebook claims that its revenue is only $194 million, but in fact, if you look at the cash in the cash flow statement, that's $1 billion. They've, like Google, decided to make up a tall story and say, we don't deem that to be revenue. And they've got their auditors to sign off on it. It's always one of the big four, PwC, Deloitte, KPMG, or EY. That's what it is. And how can they claim that this belongs somewhere else, this revenue? Because some bloke called Mark Zuckerberg had an idea 20 years ago, set up Facebook, and then he put his intellectual property in another company somewhere in a tax haven so they don't pay tax on it. And that's where all the income goes, from selling Australian products to Australians in Australia on Australian computers. But Facebook had, listen to this one, they told 9 newspapers just the other day, the SMH, this is what they said, and I quote, during the last financial years, we paid income taxes in Australia at effective tax rates well above the 30% and in accordance with local taxation laws, a Meta spokesperson said. The SMH, of course, just wrote this without questioning it, but why the blazes would you pay more than 30% when 30% is your tax rate? Why would you do it? You'd only do it because you were hiding something or made something up or because the ATO penalised you and dragged you through the courts or audited you. The reason they're claiming they paid above 30% is because they have a mythical revenue number. It's not 100 odd million, it's $1 billion. And they've just changed that number and claimed that they paid more than 30% tax. Of course, because 30% of nothing is nothing. It's all relative. Now, Labor has come up with some things it thinks will address, with proposals to address multinational tax avoidance. It should be said that this is one of the only areas where the coalition actually succeeded. In 2015, they brought in some laws to address it. It had been a mess. Jim Chalmers, the new treasurer, and his aides have come up with some things that they think will address multinational tax avoidance, and we will address these issues in due course. We'll see how they go. But the fact is, this is the biggest scam in the world. when you consider that in this country, 30% of every dollar should go to the tax office and then the government to redistribute for the elderly, the homeless, the NDIS, roads, infrastructure, bridges, defence. These are the reasons why tax exists. And you have the world's most powerful, biggest, most profitable institutions, many of them paying not 1 red cent in tax, and most of them paying very, very little. And we're going to go after this, and we're going to expose and name and shame, because that's the only way to do it. None of this broad-based analysis of problems and OECD and multilateral approaches to combat, all this kind of nonsense which they talk in bureaucracy and Big Four land. We're going to name and shame every culprit and tell you exactly how much tax they pay and they don't pay. And we're going to keep the pressure on the biggest scam in the world. Here at Michael West Media, we don't take advertising. We don't even accept YouTube advertising now, which is owned by Google. We exist purely on community support. That is support from you in order to do this. It's quite work intensive, it's labor intensive, going through the things like these financial statements to figure out what the scam is. So if you can support us or share the videos, that would be fantastic. Thank you.